thank you. I haven't done anything. I haven't said a word yet. Thank you. What a joy. I am, for those of you that don't know, I'm David Krause. I'm the co-founder, along with Tom and Sarah Arthur, of the Lewis Festival, and this is our 22nd year. Amazing. Yeah, that's worth the applause. And this is a very unique festival. Extraordinary talent that you're going to be listening to and hopefully taking notes tonight and into tomorrow at the all-day seminar, which, by the way, there are still spaces available, and there is a lunch provided. So if you're interested in coming to the all-day Saturday seminar, which I would recommend, that you can just sign up outside. So it's interesting how all of this happened. I was talking with our longtime board member, Suzanne Shumway, earlier this evening, and she said, and she knows more about J.R.R. Tolkien in her one finger than I do in my entire body. She said, Thomas Merton, Madeleine L'Engle, and C.S. Lewis. Who'd have thunk all three of these together tonight? And that is an interesting thought, and you saw the bios of all three of our speakers, which was like, wow, this is incredible talent. So let me give you, for those of you, and Sarah Arthur told me that there are all four time zones in the United States are represented here at this year's festival, which is, I think, a first. So let me give you a real quick history on how all of this came about. I have been in radio, television, and film for a long time. And I had a new feature film out on C.S. Lewis called The Life and Faith of C.S. Lewis that was airing nationwide on PBS a while ago, in 2002. You can still stream it on Amazon Prime if you'd like to, or on YouTube. It's called The Life and Faith of C.S. Lewis. And I was doing screenings all over the United States, and I just moved my family from Chicago here to Petoskey. And I didn't know a lot of people in Petoskey. In fact, we didn't know anyone. And I was looking to screen it here locally. And I was put in touch with a young couple, Tom and Sarah Arthur. Did not know them, obviously. And Tom said, called me back when he heard about the film, learned more about it. He said, we'd like to do a festival. Now that was terrorizing to me, because a festival means weekends. It means more than just 2 hours. So he said, would you at least come to the first meeting? I said, sure. So the first meeting happened, and I walked into a room, and there were a dozen people in this meeting. And they represented the arts, education, and faith community. The arts was represented by Crooked Tree Art Center. Many of you know it's the art center here in not only in Petoskey, but in the state of Michigan. Education was represented by Dale Lewis, who is principal here. I think it's Central. But subsequent to that, in the founding of the festival, we had two superintendents of the Petoskey school system on our board, and then the faith community, and that obviously involved ministers, but it also involved Tom and Sarah Arthur, and that was key, and that's how this whole festival started. In the last 22 years, we've had over 22,000 people that have attended a variety of events. And I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. I won't tonight take up the time to do that, but it's just incredible. In fact, one of the attendees a number of years ago said this is more like a Shakespeare festival than it is a religious festival. And I corrected her and I said, it's not a religious festival. Yes, that's a big part of it. It's a cultural festival, and that's key because you are attracting a much larger audience. So someone asked early on, why Petoskey? And I used the comment that Tom and Sarah Arthur told me when this festival got off the ground, why not Petoskey? And I think that rings true. And there's a wonderful quote, it's not a direct quote from Lewis or Tolkien, but rather it encapsulates them and what inspired them to write. And it says, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were enthralled of what they termed pure northernness. If you live in up northern Michigan, you understand pure northernness. It's a vision of huge, clear spaces hanging above the Atlantic, in this case, Lake Michigan, In the endless twilight of northern summer, remoteness and severity. We've experienced all of those here, and I think that really sums up Northern Michigan and why the Lewis Festival works so well here. This is a unique festival this year, our 22nd, because we're combining the L'Engle Retreat with the C.S. Lewis Festival. How did that happen? A simple phone call from Sarah Arthur, who said, I have an idea. Whenever Sarah calls and says, I have an idea, I put whatever I'm doing down, I stop and I listen, because it's generally a really good idea. And so this is what we're doing. Now, you saw what's happening tomorrow. I don't have to go through that. There will be books for sale from all four of these authors, actually, out. And we've never had four authors here that actually have published books. At the same time, that'll be out in the lobby area. And then also tomorrow, all day during the seminar. But then they will be at McLean and Eakin Booksellers, which isn't just the best bookstore in Michigan. It's one of the finest in the United States. They will also be there from 4 until 6 o'clock. And then another great idea. Kirk Caulfield, board member here, who at one of our board meetings said, he's a songwriter, a performer, and a pastor. He said, have you ever thought of a C.S. Lewis house band? Never crossed our minds. We have a C.S. Lewis house band. It will be performing tomorrow night at Beard's Brewery in downtown Petoskey. Those of you who have not been to Petoskey before, it is a wonderful space. And the co-owner of it also is a board member and also is the underwriter of tonight. And that's Peter and Carrie Monti. And we're grateful for the work that they have done as well. So, the nuts and bolts. The underwriting group tonight, again, is the Monti Group. Tonight's event sponsor are dear friends of the festival and also of my family, Carrie and Pete Mogavera. They couldn't be here tonight. And then tomorrow, my sister is covering the cost of tomorrow, and that's Karen Krause-Miller. Additional support, we're grateful for this, is the National Christian Foundation, Michigan Arts and Cultural Council, Petoskey Harbor Springs Community Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, and Petoskey Area Visitors Bureau. And also thank you to our many, many, many underwriting gifts that we have gotten from all of you. It doesn't take a lot to put this festival on, but it does take something. And we do have giving cards out in the lobby. I would encourage you to take one of those, because actually we've locked all the doors. You can't get out without getting one of them. So no, that's not a threat. I'm just kidding. But anyway, we really, really are grateful for it. We are a 501c3, and most importantly, since year 2, we have been in the black, and that's really important as well. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Want to thank our volunteers that are here at the Great Lakes Center. Isn't this a beautiful facility? Absolutely. Some of you have been here multiple times. It's a gift to the community of Petoskey. So thank you to the volunteers, to CJ, who is running the board. Grateful for that. But also our board members, Gail Harlow. Gail was, I think, literally the very first person to walk through the very first festival, the very first minute that the doors were open 22 years ago, and she's back here now, and she's also a very valued board member. Want to thank Jerry Root, also Kirk Caulfield, who I mentioned, Brian Wagner. Thank you, Brian, and Suzanne Shumway. Also our Assistant Executive Director, Alex Daly, who's done a phenomenal job with PR, as well as all of the social media, and also our consultant, Liz Ahrens, who many of you knew as president of Crooked Tree for many, many years. So we've got 3 speakers tonight. Sarah Arthur will introduce all of them, but I am just grateful to and honored, really, to be able to introduce a dear friend of not only the festival, but the Krause family, Sarah Arthur.
Thank you, David. That's my oldest son's godfather. So this is like old home week when I return here. It's wonderful to have you all here. We have the Madeleine L'Engle Writing Retreat just wrapped up a few hours ago, and it is the 3rd annual L'Engle Writing Retreat. And in the past couple years, we have been in Connecticut, near where Madeleine's her family farmhouse was and remains in the family, and that was really lovely. But the co-director of the writing retreats, Sophfronia Scott, and I, she moved from Connecticut to Michigan, and we're like, well, C.S. Lewis is not really connected to Petoskey, and even if Madeleine's not connected to Petoskey, it must be in the water to do literary events here. And we just began to think it would be really interesting to have a conversation paired with the Lewis Festival where we put Madeleine and C.S. Lewis adjacent to one another and begin to see what happens. And because Sophfronia is my co-director and has written on Trappist monk spiritual writer Thomas Merton, we began to sense that there was some synergy between these three 20th century writers who had significant influence, never met, but their readership was overlapping, and their influence continues to today. And at first, they may not seem like connected, but we have begun to realize there are strands where the conversation gets very interesting when you put C.S. Lewis from this festival, Madeleine from our retreat, in conversation with Thomas Merton. And so, as my esteemed colleagues are coming to have a seat, we're going to have a conversation together, the three of us. I will just give you a little sense of who they are and why I thought it'd be really special for you all to get a chance to meet them. Sophfronia Scott and Léna Roy, I will give you a chance to celebrate them in a minute. But Sophfronia Scott is the founding director of the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Alma College here in Michigan. She is a well-established writer in a variety of genres, began at Time Magazine and other aspects of journalism, and has since gone on to write numerous nonfiction and fiction books. Some of her books are here tonight, including The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton. And so the name of the title of that book has become the springboard off of which we felt there was an opportunity for this synergistic conversation between the three writers. Because Madeleine, Thomas Merton, and C.S. Lewis were all adult converts, if you will, to a deeper and more robust spirituality after a season of falling away from commitment and falling away from a dedicated faith. And so Thomas Merton's story as a seeker who becomes a writer and had been a writer all along but uses his writing in that way is really the theme for us here tonight, the Seeker and the Storytellers. And that's, Sophfronia, your title, thank you for that, because it has inspired this entire C.S. Lewis festival. So be sure to check that out, The Seeker and the Monk. And she's also written a wonderful novel called Wild, Beautiful, and Free. And there are not very many copies out there right now, so snatch them up while you can. Hopefully there are more at the downtown bookstore where we have our book signing tomorrow. Love's Long Line is her collection of essays that I also highly recommend. She is a leading contemplative thinker, and we are very, very honored to have her here for the C.S. Lewis Festival. So if you would, welcome Sophfronia Scott. And she's now my neighbor, basically, in mid-Michigan. So that's also lovely. And I also want to introduce to you another speaker, Léna Roy, who is with us tonight and tomorrow. She is the eldest granddaughter of Madeleine L'Engle, about whom we will talk more in a little bit. L'Engle retreat groupies, you could probably recite a lot about Léna, because Léna is a writer. She is a theater arts therapist. Am I saying that correctly? She is the program director nationally for teen programming of Writopia Lab, which is an after-school and evening and summer camp writing program for teens, youngish students, teens, and adults, and also mentoring college students. She is based now in Yonkers, New York, but her family is from the New York City area where she grew up, and then summered in Connecticut, where Madeleine's farmhouse is, and it's called Crosswicks. And so if you're familiar with some of Madeleine's writing, the Crosswicks journals are Madeleine's nonfiction, and then she's best known for A Wrinkle in Time, and we'll get into more of that. But Léna's book, Edges, is out there with a note about how to purchase that, but she also co-authored the book Becoming Madeleine, and it's the story of Madeleine L'Engle written by her granddaughters together with her sister Charlotte Jones Voikless. And Charlotte is also here, sort of incognito, but you'll get to meet her out at the table tonight at the book signing, and then she will be part of the Saturday seminar moderating the final panel discussion tomorrow. And I'll do her introduction there because there are still open spots to the Saturday seminar. So if you want to know who Charlotte is, you'll just have to come to that, I guess. So, would you join me in welcoming Léna Roy to the C.S. Lewis Festival? And each of us has an assigned author tonight. We kind of realized we needed to divvy things up. And I'll just do a brief summary of each author, and their bio will appear on the screen. So you'll have a picture and a visual. And then we'll just jump into what did they have in common? How were they different? If you visualize like the Venn diagram of like where were their overlapping influences? Why did they continue to have influence today? And then why us? Like where do we find inspiration in their journey as seekers and in their journey as writers and storytellers? So that's kind of the roadmap for tonight. We will not have a Q&A tonight, but again, sign up for the Saturday seminar because you will get a chance to ask all kinds of questions tomorrow as we go do a deeper dive, each of us, into our assigned author. So Sophfronia and I, we've done a lot related to Madeleine, but we're going to go in order, the order of when our respective authors were born. And so we'll start with C.S. Lewis, because this is the C.S. Lewis Festival, and we'll get him up there. So Lewis was, I don't know many Clives. It's not really shocking that he went by C.S. Lewis, and actually he went by the nickname Jack. But Clive Staples, he was born in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland, and really spent most of his life in Ireland and England, except when he was fighting in World War I and vacationed occasionally in France with his mother, and also visited Greece with his wife, and that was really it. So he was never in Petoskey. I mean, bottom line, like, never was here. But he was known not only as a British scholar, but of course the author of the very, very beloved Chronicles of Narnia, including The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He wrote Mere Christianity and a number of other books that are widely read still today, one of the world's best-selling authors. But Surprised by Joy, the memoir of, he calls it The Shape of My Early Life, is where he narrates that journey from his childhood, kind of faith upbringing to atheism to his turn towards Christianity. And so I will be doing a deeper dive into Surprised by Joy specifically tomorrow at the Saturday seminar. So despite how much I love Madeleine, and having written a book about her called A Light So Lovely, The Spiritual Legacy of Madeleine, she's, which is out there, my assigned author is C.S. Lewis, and he died in 1963. I wrote a letter to Macmillan asking a question to C.S. Lewis, and they wrote back and they were like, well, he died before he was born, but, so anyway, so that's Lewis. And then, so then our next author, Thomas Merton, who we've already mentioned, he was born in 1915, also died rather young, like very much younger than either of the other two, although Lewis was only 65.
But Merton was only 53.
Yeah, Merton was only 53, so 1968. He was actually born in France, but to one of his parents was from New Zealand. What is his mother?
Yes.
Yeah, and she was a painter.
Yeah.
His father, also a painter, but from the United States. And they landed in France. And that's where he was born. And then he kind of bounced around different places in Europe through boarding school, et cetera, and then ended up in the United States. And eventually, after studying at Columbia and doing all of the aspiring writer things, had a conversion to a really dedicated Catholic faith, became a Trappist monk, cloistered in a monastery in Kentucky. And his writings, especially Seven Story Mountain, became what he was best known for, really. So
Made him famous.
it made him famous. Yeah, so Sophfronia will bring some wisdom about Merton both tonight and tomorrow. And I love, The Seeker and the Monk's amazing. So make sure you pick up a copy. It's just lovely. And then finally, Madeleine L'Engle, who I was kind of startled to realize she was born only 3 years after Merton, but she lived till 2007. I mean, like, she's our oldest living author of the three. And so there's a way that her legacy is different because she published like 60 titles and would have kept going, right? But, she had a really long stretch, whereas our guys was a little shorter. So who knows what they would have written if they had lived as long as Madeleine. But anyway, she is best known for winning the Newbery in 1963, which is the highest honor in children's literature for A Wrinkle in Time. And also then went, like I said, 60 titles. Her memoir-esque books, the Crosswicks Journals, A Circle of Quiet, came out in 1972, and that is the theme of the Madeleine L'Engle retreats every year. And this year, our discussion was on place and location and where your feet are on the ground and how that influences the way that we create and what we create, and we are both transformed by the places that we are, and then things about us that remain the same from place to place. So she too was an adult convert to Christianity, and so Léna, since she's your grandmother, you really know more about her than either of us, even though we lead the Madeleine L'Engle writing retreats. And Léna has also been a facilitator at our retreats with us. So your assigned author is Madeleine L'Engle. Sound good?
Sounds good to
Sounds
me.
good. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just really quickly run through what they have in common, and then we'll jump into our conversation. All right. So imagine a Venn diagram, and we're gonna put some things in the middle of the Venn diagram. It's the circle of C.S. Lewis, Thomas Merton, and Madeleine L'Engle. We should have a graphic for this. Where's Alex Daly? We forgot. We forgot this graphic. We should have a Venn diagram. It's all right. Next time I'll give you better notes. So some of the things they had in common, neither of them, they kind of experienced a similar stretch of time in the 20th century with 2 world wars, and those were pretty significant to all 3 of them. Lewis fought in World War I as a very, very young man, and L'Engle's father fought in World War I. The 3 of them have particularly devout upbringings. That wasn't something that was like super emphasized. As children and teens, each of them lost a parent far too young, and Merton lost 2.
He lost both his parents.
Both his parents.
Yes, his mom died when he was about 7, and his father died when he was a teenager. So when you mentioned he was at boarding school, he was pretty much on his own.
Right.
Even though he had a younger brother, he practically existed as an only child in certain ways.
Yeah.
They all went to boarding school.
And and that's the other thing, they all went to boarding school, which we found very interesting. And actually boarding school abroad. So Lewis, ended up, the first time he went to England from Ireland was 3 weeks after his mom died when he was 10 or 9. It was just brutal. And, leaving his home country to go away. And then Madeleine was
12.
And in Switzerland for a boarding school and British boarding school. And then Merton was in British boarding schools, but also in Europe and in England.
Yeah, in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
But there were times when on vacation, and this kind of bewildered me to think about it because I have a son. 15, 16-year-old on a school holiday, and he went off hiking in Germany by himself.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, okay, nobody looking after this child. He actually develops an infection from a toe injury he suffered during that trip, nearly died from it. And I can only think of the fact of how alone he must have felt, right, in those moments.
Yeah. And loneliness is a theme that runs through, if you read Surprised by Joy, and Lewis talks about being at boarding school and missing his older brother and not having a particularly strong relationship with his dad. So you have these, and Madeleine tell us about being dropped off at boarding school in Switzerland really quickly. So loneliness being a theme
The
here.
loneliness being a theme. Well, she and her family had moved to Switzerland for the fresher air because her father had been gassed during the war and had terrible asthma. So they were thinking that the climate would be better. And
it was cheaper in Europe
and
at
it was
the time.
cheaper in Europe at the time. And Madeleine was happy to be with them. She thought they were going on a picnic. They told her that they were going on a picnic. And so she was very surprised when it was not a picnic, but she was dropped off at a boarding school in Switzerland.
In Switzerland.
Yes.
Where she knew nobody. And this is something that probably wouldn't happen today, but maybe, I don't know, maybe it was a sign of the times. Yeah. And she had a hard time making friends and a hard time fitting in. And so writing became her escape, and drawing pictures and doing stories and all of that kind of thing. And you see a similar experience for C.S. Lewis in Surprised by Joy. He goes off to a boarding school eventually that his brother adored and hated it. So he, not only the loneliness of not fitting in, but your brother was cooler. So I think for the three of them, that loneliness becomes a theme where they begin to cultivate this really deep and rich interior life. And that sets the stage for some of probably what happens later for them as adults in their change and transformation in faith. So we see all three of them honing their writing craft as young people. So you see them doing this in what is essentially high school and in college, honing their writing crafts. Lewis thought he was a poet. He was going to write epic poetry and poetry that, was going to change the world. And it was very modestly received. And Madeleine was going to write stage plays. It was going to be theater, right? And that's a big part of the autobiographical account that you and Charlotte give of her younger life, is that a lot of people don't know that she was a theater person and she wanted to write stage plays.
And everything else.
And everything else. She wanted to do it all. She wanted to do it all. And then at a certain point in their adult lives, each of them had some pretty significant turning points. And I think all three of them could point to moments. And for Merton in particular, it was pretty significant moments where they experienced something outside of themselves that was drawing them to the spiritual life in a very compelling way, to which they said yes. And so I thought it'd be interesting for each of us to kind of just briefly summarize those moments, because some people know Lewis pretty well, some people know Madeleine pretty well in this audience. Not so many would maybe know Merton, although how many of you have read Seven Storey Mountain or read any Merton at all? Oh, great. What a literary crowd. This is lovely. So why don't we start with, Lewis, because he was born first, and quick summary. He became what he would call like a hard-boiled atheist at some point in his teens, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but then he, over time, that began to unravel as he was a reader, and the more he read, the more he realized that the things that he really loved, the mythologies and the stories that he really loved, were untrue, and then the things that he was supposed to believe in with Christianity, he didn't love those things at all. And then he began to bring his imagination together with this love of story and realize that God is part of, he's for Lewis, God is at the heart of anything we love that's beautiful and good and true. And so in a series of different kind of conversions, first as a theist and then to Christianity, he eventually, his famous account, he was the most, finally knelt, confessed that God was God, the most reluctant convert in England. So that's Lewis's story. And he was young. He was fairly young at that point, but an adult after being a hard-boiled atheist. So Merton is next.
Merton was a bit of a rake as a young man. So, as you can imagine, him with no parental guidance, off running around at boarding school. He eventually went to Cambridge, and he was a womanizer and a drinker. And he eventually got a girl pregnant, and his guardian basically had enough of him and said, he got sent down, meaning kicked out of Cambridge. And his guardian basically sent him to live with family in the US and funded his education at Columbia. So he transferred to Columbia. While he was at Columbia, he made some significant friends, which I will discuss tomorrow, but he also ended up in a religious studies class that made him start thinking about his life in a different way and made him start thinking about Christianity and Catholicism in particular. And he eventually converted, but that is not the conversion or the moment of transcendence that Sarah is talking about. The moment that Sarah is talking about came long after he became a monk. And long after he wrote Seven Storey Mountain, long after he wrote New Seeds of Contemplation, where he had spent a good amount of time in those early years in the monastery writing about the interior journey and feeling separate from the world, as a cloistered monk should. But on this particular day, and they call this his epiphany at 4th and Walnut, he's in Louisville, Kentucky, standing on the street corner and watching the crowds, watching the city move about him, and he suddenly realizes that he was not separate from all of these people, that if anything, we were one. There was a wholeness and energy to everyone. And he said, how can, he couldn't even express it. And how could he even tell them? He said, how can you tell them that they are walking around all shining like the sun, right? And and this is a point, his writing changed after that because it went from the interior journey to speaking of what was going on in the world. He started writing about peace. He started writing against nuclear war. He started writing about civil rights, much to the consternation of the Catholic Church, who felt it was unbecoming to a monk to be writing about peace. But he saw that even though he was in this monastery, that he was part of the world, and that he had an obligation to be a part of it in any way that he could. And that is why I feel that's one of the reasons why we still think about him and talk about him today, is because what he wrote during those years was so prophetic that we are still living the things that he spoke about 50 years ago.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah. And then Madeleine.
Well,
Madeleine was a cradle Episcopalian in a way,
yes,
but they didn't go much because Dad wrote reviews of opera, and when you're up all night, you're not on a Saturday. You're not going to church on a Sunday,
and
right?
she didn't have as she said, a road to Damascus conversion experience. It was slow. I mean, she grew up. They were both. I mean, they didn't go to church every Sunday, but I mean, they were both Episcopalian, and in that time, everybody knew Scripture. So, and when she went to Jacksonville, she was going to church with her grandmother, and was very, I imagined that she read scripture, but not regularly. And when she was in the theater, and when she was in her 20s, and she was lonely, and as she says, before she met my grandfather, had been around the block. So, but they moved, but she was always writing, and they moved up to, they bought a farmhouse called Crossways, and she was lonely and longing for community, so she joined a congregation, and it was the 50s, and and I talk about this, I'll talk about this tomorrow, but like there was conformity and the Red Scare in Goshen, and she was just turned to reading books to try to understand theology. She was looking at German theologians, and just it wasn't fitting in with what she understood at all. and she just kept writing. She just kept looking. She was craving something else. She was craving God. So so A Wrinkle in Time ended up being she calls it her hymn to praise to God. So she was writing what she needed. She was writing she was figuring out her own version of Christianity. But I think she would always identify as a Christian, like always. So I think it was a slow coming to believe, and also she was her writing informed her faith. She was writing signs in, and that was the way. Then she started seeing. Then she was able to start to see signs everywhere. And so in 1972, A Circle of Quiet came out, and so she's talking about nature and finding God within and without. Yeah.
The burning bush.
The burning bush.
The burning bush of creation, pointing the way to who God is, and that we're on holy ground and in God's presence. Yeah.
Yeah. Everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. So something I find interesting with that theme of loneliness, might be fun for us to keep pressing into that, because Lewis was also he was not a Puritan before his conversion. So it's interesting that they were seeking companionship and seeking some way to fill what probably felt like a kind of void in companionship and even in family in a lot of ways. That's really interesting. A couple of other things that they had in common. They eventually, after these journeys that they were on and continuing in their journeys, made their home in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. I mean, I think, you see the liturgies and the way that the Anglo-Catholic tradition talks about faith is very much alive in their work. And they were not only but writing from within those traditions, they were still able to speak to such a broad readership, which I think is fascinating. And they all really became famous as they were turning to writing to express their journeys. It was after they started to write out of this transformation and out of this faith that they became well known. It's interesting that they weren't super famous prior to this.
Well, Merton was.
Was he? Oh, okay. Tell me more.
No, he was still a very young monk. This, Seventh Story Mountain was his first book. It made him a star.
Oh, as a monk, though.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
It made him a star. So
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
everything that he published after that was, anticipated, devoured. It was, the thing. So it was totally unexpected, but it was big.
So, and then what you're saying is that, like, the later conversion of him standing on the street in Lexington and feeling part of everything was the much more important one. Like, so that there was this
His-
conversion to becoming a monk, but then there was
Yeah.
like
A
this
turning.
other level.
Exactly. And his writings are very different.
Yeah.
So there is a writing
Yeah.
before that and writings after that. And still tons of work on both sides. You know, a woman recently told me she was in a Catholic bookstore and she was looking for some works of Merton. And the woman said to him, said to her, well, yes, we have these books, like, you know, they had everything before the Epiphany. They had New Seeds of Contemplation. They had, you know, The Sign of Jonas. They had Seven Story Mountain. But those other books, well, he wasn't a Catholic anymore after that. We don't have those.
Yeah, interesting. So there's sort of the other thing that I see them doing that's actually not on my list, and this might make a great talk sometime, is where they all came. They were inside of these traditions, but because they stepped over some lines, that's how, you know, that we are all on a journey. Like, we're all growing and changing. And so it's interesting that even once they've published, there's still, you know, there's still new things they're learning, and they're still getting that information out there and still inviting people to journey with them. And Lewis, in some ways, you know, he was part of the Oxford Socratic Club and or society or whatever it was, and he invited these debates and would facilitate these debates. And at a certain point, he was then in a debate with a young woman who challenged him on some of the things that he was saying about his theology. And it really kind of brought him up short. And some of his biographers would point to that moment, you know, where he didn't have all the answers. Up to that point, he had been the answer man, right? Like everything he wrote, you know, everybody was like, he's a genius, it's brilliant, it all makes sense. But at that moment, he realized there were, you know, he didn't have all the answers. And it's interesting that the next batch of stuff that he writes after that is fiction. He's writing the Chronicles of Narnia. And so he's making a turn. Like, the problem of pain was fairly early on, and that's, you know, a very cerebral discussion of suffering and, like, why does God allow suffering? And that's a very different experience as a reader than when you read what some of the characters in the Chronicles of Narnia go through in their suffering. And it has a kind of humanity to it. And then when he lost his own wife and you read A Grief Observed, I mean, he's a different person by that point.
Actually, sir, I want to ask you about that. So the woman challenging him in the debate, so how long after that did he meet Joy, who would become his wife? Because didn't she kind of challenge him in the same way?
She pushed him, it was like the intellectual muscle of, like, an exchange where she wasn't afraid to be like, that's baloney, what are you talking about? And to go back and forth. But whether that influenced him theologically, I'm not as certain about. I think he enjoyed the argument. And then, I mean, one of the beautiful things about the Lewis Festival is that sense that you can have differing opinions and still at the end of the day go and get a pint together down at Beard's. This is a lost art in our culture, but Lewis valued that in friendship and in closeness and companionship.
And so, yeah.
And yeah, when Suzanne Shumway's in the room, she and I have discussed at various points Till We Have Faces, which is one of his last novels that he wrote. And a lot of biographers, including Abigail Santamaria, who is writing, she wrote the biography of Joy, and she's doing the biography of the authoritative biography of your grandmother. You know, she believed that, like, you know, what Joy did in that book, like, she was a big participant in writing the book, that last book. And it's written from the perspective of a woman in first person. He's crazy if he's going to do that without at least having Joy reading it or somebody, you know. But the voice, even the way it's written is very different than a lot of his other work. Yeah. So.
Well, I think one of the things that was really important to my grandmother, and it sounds like it was really important to both Merton and Lewis, was to be in conversation, you know. So whether that's in conversation with yourself in your journal, and exorcising that loneliness, like by talking to God and journaling, or having conversations with an author by reading. I think she developed in later years. Certainly, her relationship with my father and with Canon West kept her
the
spiritual.
Cathedral of St. John the Divine
And
in
at the-
Manhattan.
Having these spiritual friendships where she could
Yes.
really kind of talk to equals and grow in her spirituality and in her sense of self in the world. I think that was really valuable to her. And she knew that like not one person couldn't fit everything. Like one person can't. We need community. We need other people. Like you can't just look to a husband or a romantic partner to fill all of your needs. Like you have to have other relationships. So
To make the turn quickly towards their ongoing influence, one of the questions I've been thinking about is if they hadn't had these moments of, transformation, and these moments where, whether it's, becoming a monk and then his moment of epiphany, whether it's, Madeleine writing Wrinkle in Time as her hymn of praise and her rebuttal to the German theologians, as she also called it, and Lewis's Surprised by Joy. What would be different now about the way people talk about faith and the way they write? And because these were, Merton was a rock star in his time, and so were Lewis and Madeleine.
that's a hard question, but it's a good one. So I mean, so you're asking us what what darkness would be on the world if we didn't have their...
reverse that and just say like their ongoing influences due to X, Y, and Z.
Right. Well, I think that Madeleine for sure has a very open theology, and it's very accessible. And she, so my talk tomorrow is about her writing towards hope. And I know that she has given hope to so many others. I've heard from so many people that they learned their spiritual values from Madeleine L'Engle. So, and I think that each one of us, the more that we have our feet in the ground in our own spirituality, the more we're going to kind of just be positive in our own authenticity, and encourage others to do the same, and that's what makes the world a better place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've been at this for a couple of days now,
Really?
and then we all want world peace.
We all want world peace, and then everybody be nice to each other. Let's just all be kind. Just be good.
That's funny.
No, the world would be, if we didn't have these guys, these people, the world, it would be darker.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say, at least in my experience with Madeleine, I'm a breast cancer survivor. I've mentioned that before at the Lewis Festival, and I made it through some of my infusions on rage alone. And if there's anybody who taught me the spiritual discipline of rage, it was Madeleine. I mean, she allowed us to be mad at God in her writing, and I really hadn't encountered anybody else who said, it's okay to be mad. Have you read the Psalms? They're mad. Come on, what's God? Flex your muscles. What are you doing? Your reputation's at stake. I was mad, and I was grateful for that permission to be angry from Madeleine, and also I was grateful to Lewis that I didn't have to check my brain at the door to be a person of faith. Like that was a big deal to me as somebody for whom, loving the Lord your God with all your mind. Like, that's, yeah, like, okay, well, let's investigate this faith. Let's see if it holds all the way down. It's okay. It doesn't freak God out to do that. Like, it's not going to hurt his feelings if you're like, yeah, but what about? And that was important for me.
Well, that was such an important message. That was one of the most important things about A Wrinkle in Time, was
Yes.
that,
Yes.
there was a female protagonist, and she
She's a
wasn't,
mathematician.
and she was not, and she wasn't, she was, awkward and angry, and she had all of these,
Maybe 14.
she had all of these, that had never happened before in literature. So she was allowed to have her feelings and be a full, and then Mrs. Witch gives her faults.
Yes.
Like that we are whole people. Like we
And those
we
are her strengths. That's
and
how
that
she's
those are
going to overcome
strengths.
the darkness. Her
It-
faults.
her faults, her
and
anger,
Her anger. Yep. Her anger.
her anger.
Love it. Yeah.
Mhm.
So Merton, as I mentioned earlier, wrote prophetically. And I think people come to Merton and see a voice speaking to our times. So, for example, in his book, Seeds of Destruction, he talks about how, yes, it's great that the Civil Rights Act had just passed, but he said nothing's really going to change because people don't realize the level to which they personally have to change.
Right. That's right.
And we are still, we are living out exactly what he said, right? Because really how much has changed in certain ways. Another thing he wrote about, he described relationships as operating in a marketplace, right? That we treat dating and relationships as we are in the marketplace, and we are only valued by how many deals that we make on any given day. And even once we have a deal, we are looking to the next deal, right? Imagine what he would have thought of online dating.
I was just going to say, and this is before social
Right,
media.
this was long before social media. He saw that.
Yeah.
He saw that, and we are living what he was talking about, but now just doing it at the swipe right, swipe left, right? That fast, right? He saw that. But at the same time, he writes about, especially in his journals, this ongoing seeking and questioning of God and trying to understand what God wants of him, but also wanting to love God and trying to feel the sense of God. There's a beautiful moment where he writes about, he's sitting in a room at the monastery writing, and he gets so into the work. He said that I feel as if that I'm very clear, like a mirror, and there are times when I feel that God has come close to me, and right there, and I can feel it. And I think so many of us want that mystical experience, right? We want our own encounter with the divine. We hunger for it. And for him to be able to express it, right, to put words to it, because I think that is the true challenge of writing about faith, is to put words to this inexpressible thing, right? And to connect us, because we're able to look at that and say, yes, yeah, that's what I'm hungering for, or that's what I want, or yes, I felt that too, so I'm not crazy, right? He was able to do that. You know, we have this sense of him on a pedestal, this monk, you know, cloistered in his hermitage. But really, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, he was just a guy, right? Very, you know, human guy. And because of that, he is accessible. He's accessible, and through him, he accesses the world for me in a certain way. So he will continue to be relevant as long as we are seeking, we're looking for a guide, and I think he does that job very well.
And Madeleine did that through fiction, because there was truth in fiction, and being able to. Sorry, I just blanked out.
No, you're totally fine. Well, I was thinking about her distinction between facts and truth, right? So, like, facts are like the journalistic account of something, and fiction can still have truth in it, because it, you know, journalism talks about what happened, but fiction talks about what happens. I mean, this is what happens.
And the
in
emotions behind it, and the universal the universal truths, right?
That
The
we-
lessons and
Mhm.
and then also and finding God, finding the signs, finding, being pointed in the right direction through fiction.
Yeah.
I was supposed to tell you when it was 8, and it's
Thank you.
8:01.
8:01. Okay. Well, I see 8 up there, so we're good.
Okay.
So we're gonna wind down, and I want to make sure that we have some time for announcements from the Lewis Festival. Anything else that we need to announce for whoever's announcing, and I don't see an announcer. So maybe I'll just tell you about what's happening tomorrow. We were gonna try to wind down with just like how they have influenced us. So if you have another hour and a half, just kidding.
2 days.
So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll bracket that question as far as like, how have you as you're writing Sophfronia, like where do you sense that Merton has influenced you as a seeker and a storyteller? And same with you, Léna, with Madeleine, and you're a storyteller, and you're also a seeker, and same with me. And what I think we'll do is we'll get to that. Charlotte, you want to like jot that question down, and we can tackle it at the end of the day tomorrow in a Saturday seminar.
And we can just
And then
tell
if
you to come to our seminars
just,
tomorrow.
again, another pitch for the seminar. But also those lectures are often, as I understand it, recorded and then will be on the Lewis Festival website. So if they're not being recorded, I'm sorry. I hope they are. I hope they are.
Were
So-
these the announcements? What's on the screen
Yeah,
now? Okay.
yeah, and they can read them all. Tomorrow's a big day, so Saturday seminar followed by book signing, followed by the house band performance and Beard's Brewery. That's the where we dance on the tables part. That's that we're done. We will be done with all of the talking, and we can party and have fun.
No, Sarah, you and I are speaking on Sunday morning.
Oh, doggone it! Then on Sunday. All right. Well, we can't stay out too late Saturday night. Yeah.
You and I can
Sorry.
anyway.
All right. Well, the rest of you dance on tables, and then make sure you show up at either Emmanuel Episcopal to hear Sophfronia, and we want to thank those congregations for hosting us, and First Presbyterian Church, where I'll be the preacher at my parents' church in Petoskey, 9:30 for me and 10 o'clock for you. And then we can dance on tables after that. Maybe just you and me.
I might just go
this-
fishing, Sarah.
Yeah, I think we'll go sleep.
Well, the Spirit will
was
move
this-
you at the service,
There we
right?
go, yeah,
So that's
right.
dancing on tables.
Right, I know.
You don't
It was-
need others.
We're all Pentecostals now. We'll dance on the tables. And just a quick shout out and a thank you to First Presbyterian for hosting the Madeleine L'Engle retreat and all of our retreatants Thursday night and Friday. So we are going to make our way to the lobby where we'll be, for those of you who are looking to find some books tonight. But then also be sure to come out and check out McLean and Aiken if you haven't yet in person, because there's lots of other lovely stuff there tomorrow from
And
4
the
to 6.
lectures are not in this room tomorrow, but in the community room.
When you come in, there will be signage for where to find tomorrow's Saturday seminar lectures, where we will do a deeper dive into each of our authors. And then we'll dance on tables. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.